The sport of MMA is still incredibly young, and it is evolving at a rate that is sometimes hard to keep up with. Because of superstars like Ronda Rousey and Conor McGregor, there are people who have only been watching the UFC in the era of Reebok and USADA. When you consider how ubiquitous random drug testing is in the modern era of the UFC, it's almost unbelievable that at one point fighters were allowed to use what was, in effect, legal steroids, with the most infamous being the terrifying reign of TRT Vitor. However, to fully understand the rise and fall of TRT, we need to study the events and decisions that allowed this bizarre moment in MMA history to happen. A good starting point would be Chael Sonnen, as he is probably the first person to bring the subject of TRT into the larger MMA conversation. After an intense and racially charged buildup that saw Sonnen insult Anderson Silva, his family, friends, teammates, and the entire country of Brazil, Sonnen and Silva faced off at UFC 117. To the surprise of many, Chael found more success against Silva than any of his previous opponents in the UFC. Not only was Chael able to use his elite wrestling to take Silva down and batter him on the ground, but he held his own on the feet as well. However, in one of the most iconic moments in the sport's history, Silva was able to catch Sonnen in a triangle choke late in the 5th round, forcing Chael to tap out. Because of Sonnen's shocking performance, in which he actually hit Silva more times in one fight than he had been hit in his entire UFC career up to that point, an immediate rematch was announced. Unfortunately, this would prove premature, as not long after the fight, the California State Athletic Commission announced that Chael had failed a post-fight drug test, where his testosterone level was nearly 17 times higher than average. The story surrounding Chael's test failure and subsequent battle with the CSAC is so convoluted that it merits its own MMA Lore video. But to make a long story short, the CSAC initially suspended Chael for a year and fined him $2,500 stemming from his failed drug test at UFC 117. However, Chael appealed their suspension and appeared before the CSAC on December 2, 2010 to plead his case. During the hearing, Chael and his counsel made several absurd claims, such as Chael having never gone through puberty and that he was suffering from hypogonadism.
Now, as you can see from our papers, Chael has a well-documented medical condition, hypogonadism.
Known as hypogonadism,
which he had been treating with testosterone replacement therapy starting in 2008. He also claimed that he had cleared his TRT use with Keith Kaiser, the head of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, but neither Chael, his lawyer, or his doctor were able to provide any evidence to back their claims up. Still, at the time, testosterone replacement therapy was not prohibited as long as fighters acquired a so-called therapeutic use exemption, or TUE. So, the issue is that he had failed to properly disclose a medical treatment. As such, the commission voted to reduce his suspension to 6 months, which would end in March of 2011. There was a problem though. According to Keith Kaiser, head of the NSAC, he had never spoken to Sonnen in his entire life, and had only engaged in a brief conversation about the subject of TRT with Chael's manager, Matt Linland. So, as Chael's initial suspension was nearing an end, the CSAC suspended him indefinitely, citing his potentially false testimony, as well as his unrelated felony money laundering conviction. But in yet another twist, the CSAC couldn't actually suspend Sonnen indefinitely, so they just suspended him until his license expired. The irony being that when Sonnen did eventually return to fighting, he was actually granted a TUE for TRT in the state of Nevada. Even though he had no credible evidence that his use of TRT was legitimate, he was able to frame it as medicine, and not a performance-enhancing drug, which would be the main defense of TRT over the coming years. Once TRT became common knowledge in MMA circles, many fighters came forward about their use of the therapy, and others started applying for exemptions to treat their alleged low testosterone. Dan Henderson is perhaps the earliest known example, having started TRT in 2007, but there were others. Some of them were well-known fighters and even former champions like Forrest Griffin, Quentin Rampage Jackson, and Frank Mir. Nevertheless, people were still skeptical that TRT was being used strictly as a medical treatment, and not to gain an advantage over other fighters. It was one thing for a guy like Dan Henderson to claim he had low testosterone. He was already 37 years old when he started TRT, with decades of grueling competition behind him. He also never made any ridiculous claims about dying if he stopped using the therapy, and never failed any drug tests. But it was not the same for other users of TRT. Take the case of Todd Duffy as an example. Duffy looks like the result of an experiment by escaped Nazi scientists to create an Aryan super soldier out of gorilla meat and your girlfriend's sexual frustration. But despite being built like one of Zeus's sons, Duffy was apparently diagnosed with low testosterone at the age of only 24, and placed on TRT as a result. Duffy's use of TRT may have been completely legitimate and entirely therapeutic, but it still gave people cause for concern that so many seemingly otherwise healthy fighters were suddenly being diagnosed with low testosterone that required them to take what, again, was basically legal steroids. Another red flag was the fact that a potential cause of low testosterone is prior steroid abuse, an issue that was especially notable in the case of Vitor Belfort, who had previously tested positive for 4-hydroxytestosterone at Pride 32, which took place in the state of Nevada. I just want you to file that away in the back of your mind for later. The reputation of TRT as a legitimate medical treatment was further cast into doubt by several high-profile drug test failures. In June of 2011, Nate Marquardt was cut by the UFC after failing his pre-fight medicals for his welterweight debut against Rick Story at UFC on Versus 4. Shortly thereafter, Marquardt appeared on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani and claimed that he had been on TRT for nearly a year. Nate's doctor suggested a more aggressive treatment that led to his levels being too high for the Pennsylvania Commission. Although Nate claimed his testosterone levels were within acceptable limits by fight night, it should also be noted that he had previously failed a drug test for nandrolone in 2006, a fact that Dana White was quick to point out when he stated the UFC was done with Nate Marquardt. Another case of a high-profile drug test failure related to TRT are the incidents surrounding Alistair Overeem. Accusations of steroid use had swirled around Overeem for years due to the massive amount of muscle he put on while moving up to fight in the heavyweight division. Overeem credited his consumption of horse meat for his rapid growth, but ahead of his 2012 fight with Junior Dos Santos, Overeem failed the drug test for elevated testosterone. Overeem blamed his test failure on an anti-inflammatory injection mixed with testosterone, administered by his doctor to treat a rib injury. The Nevada State Athletic Commission didn't buy this explanation and denied Overeem's application for a license until December of 2012. It may not be a case of a fighter on TRT failing a drug test, but Overeem's excuse that the use of testosterone was medicinal in nature was so similar to excuses made by fighters like Marquardt and Sonnen that I thought it warranted mentioning here. Finally, in December of 2013, Mark Hunt and Antonio Bigfoot Silva put on one of the best heavyweight fights in MMA history. Unfortunately, the majesty of the fight was tarnished when it was revealed that Silva had failed a post-fight drug test for elevated testosterone. Silva is a rare case of a fighter with a legitimate, diagnosed, and documented need for testosterone replacement therapy, as he suffers from acromegaly. However, there is the caveat that, like several other fighters using TRT, Bigfoot Silva had previous drug test failures on his record, testing positive for boldenone in 2008. It's really no surprise that during this time period, Dana White was switching opinions about TRT on a monthly basis, going from saying it should be banned one month to approving of it in the next. It probably had nothing to do with the fact that when the UFC held events in countries that didn't have regulatory bodies for MMA, the UFC itself acted as a commission and handed out therapeutic use exemptions for fighters. There were many more stories to come out of the TRT era, but the most notorious is the unbelievably violent run that Vitor Belfort went on in 2013. It's unclear when Vitor Belfort started using testosterone replacement therapy. An often cited date is 2011, after his fight with Anderson Silva, but his fight with Jon Jones in 2012 seems to be the point where people realized something was different about Vitor. He was bigger, bulkier, and a shade of red that only comes from snorting lines of super male vitality. The new and improved Vitor then nearly shocked the world when he locked up an armbar and came the closest that anyone has come to finishing Jon Jones. Jon survived and managed to submit Vitor with an arm lock of his own early in the 4th round. What followed was an orgy of violence the likes of which has never been seen before or since. Each fight became progressively more ridiculous. Vitor would come out looking like he just got done telling Hulk Hogan to crash the plane, then he would decapitate someone with his feet and cut a post-fight promo praising Jesus Christ. It was utter mohawk mullet insanity. By the time Vitor fought Dan Henderson for the second time, he looked like he was about to overdose on tanning pills, and his jaw muscles were the size of softballs. This was a decade and a half of experience, combined with so much testosterone that the UFC had to put nets along the Brazilian coastline every time Vitor fought to prevent horny female bull sharks from beaching themselves. At this point, I've just about run out of Sean Baby-esque superlatives to describe TRT Vitor. The simple fact of the matter is that what he did during 2013 was hard to believe. In 1 year, he kicked Michael Bisping so hard that the Count's eye was permanently damaged. Then he blasted Luke Rockhold with a spinning heel kick and punches that derailed what many at the time thought would be a quick route to the title for Luke. Finally, as if trying to top a spinning kick knockout, Vitor landed an uppercut on Dan Henderson that literally knocked Henderson off his feet. Then, after a perfectly timed head kick and a few follow-up shots, he became the first man to stop Dan Henderson with strikes. This run was enough to earn Vitor a title shot against Chris Weidman. However, the fight would not happen as fans expected. As Vitor staged a devastating comeback during what should have been the twilight of his career, he was accused of abusing TRT. The Brazilian MMA Commission had only formed in January of 2013, and there were questions about whether Vitor would even be able to get a therapeutic use exemption for TRT in Nevada, as Nevada State Athletic Commission head Keith Kaiser stated that Vitor probably would not get an exemption due to his prior drug test failure in 2006. It was all ultimately irrelevant though. On February 27th of 2014, the Nevada State Athletic Commission voted unanimously to ban testosterone replacement therapy, citing a lack of resources to properly monitor all of the individuals with exemptions. Shortly thereafter, the Brazilian MMA Commission followed suit, so even if Vitor was hiding from drug tests by fighting in Brazil, that loophole would no longer be available. As a result, Belfort withdrew from his fight with Chris Weidman and was replaced by Lyoto Machida. Vitor later revealed that he had in fact failed a random drug test administered by the Nevada State Athletic Commission. Vitor stated that at the time he was not licensed to fight in Nevada, but complied with the commission's request and informed them that he was currently undergoing TRT. The test showed elevated levels of testosterone, but Vitor claimed that subsequent tests he voluntarily took showed that his levels had returned to normal. It would later be learned that Vitor had failed the previous drug test ahead of his 2012 fight with John Jones. The UFC allowed the fight to take place anyway, and the details of this test failure are only known because an internal UFC email containing the results of Vitor's drug test showing high testosterone levels was accidentally sent to multiple unintended recipients. The recipients were then asked to delete the email ASAP by UFC Executive Vice President Ike Lawrence Epstein, but obviously they were not. It should be noted that at the time, it was not publicly known that Vitor Belfort was taking TRT. Even the Ontario Athletic Commission was not aware of Vitor's TRT use, because the UFC was the entity providing him with a therapeutic use exemption. Belfort would eventually fight Weidman for the UFC middleweight title in May of 2015. However, it was apparent during the build-up to the fight, and especially during the pre-fight weigh-in, that Vitor's physique had dramatically changed. He looked like a different person. Side-by-side comparisons of Vitor with and without TRT show that he was considerably smaller and lacked the defined musculature that made him such an imposing figure during his 2013 run. Nevertheless, Vitor was able to find success early in the fight with a few barrages of strikes that seemed to hurt Weidman. He quickly tired though, and was eventually taken down by Weidman and finished with ground and pound. Vitor went on to fight 6 more times after losing to Weidman, with his only wins coming against Dan Henderson and Nate Marquardt. In the rest of his fights with the UFC, he was knocked out in brutal fashion. After losing his fight against Lyoto Machida via front kick knockout, Belfort retired from MMA in May of 2018. By December, he had already unretired though, and in March of 2019, had signed with ONE FC, a Singapore-based MMA promotion. It's unknown when Vitor will have his first fight for the promotion, or who he will face, but ever since he signed with ONE FC, Vitor's body has begun to take on a more muscular appearance. Most fighters who had been taking TRT would continue to fight without it, with mixed to negative results. In another story so convoluted it deserves its own video, both Vanderlei Silva and Chael Sonnen were pulled from UFC 175. Vanderlei for refusing to submit to a drug test by the Nevada State Athletic Commission, and Chael for failing multiple drug tests, testing positive for anastrozole, clomiphene, HCG, human growth hormone, and EPO. These drug test failures led to a 2-year suspension and Chael losing his job as an analyst for the UFC. Chael never fought in the UFC again after TRT was banned, and went 2-2 in Bellator before retiring. Dan Henderson also traded wins and losses in the post-TRT era, before facing Michael Bisping for the UFC middleweight strap, losing a close fight, and then retiring. But perhaps the saddest post-TRT story is that of Antonio Bigfoot Silva. As mentioned earlier, Bigfoot is one of the few legitimate cases where TRT is medically necessary. At one point, according to Bigfoot's manager, his testosterone levels were so low that he started lactating due to a hormonal imbalance. I don't know why he would reveal something that embarrassing, but in any case, what do you think Bigfoot milk would taste like? Let me know in the comments. Since TRT was banned, Bigfoot has lost 9 of his last 10 fights between MMA, kickboxing, and bare-knuckle boxing. 8 of those losses have come by way of KO or TKO. He's in such bad shape that he wasn't even medically cleared for a kickboxing match that was supposed to take place in November of 2019. You can put some of the blame on reckless booking, I don't know why anyone would look at an MMA fighter who has been knocked out in half a dozen straight fights and think he should be put in the ring with the world's best heavyweight kickboxer. And maybe Bigfoot was on the decline anyway, but you can't argue that he doesn't look dramatically worse without testosterone. The legacy of TRT is hard to place. It seems as though it has been largely overshadowed by the advent of the USADA era of the UFC, which brought sweeping changes to the drug testing policies in the organization, though not without a fair share of controversies that have drawn the true motivation and goals of USADA into question. But that is another video. We can debate the ethics of allowing fighters to use testosterone, but this era of the sport certainly produced a lot of entertaining fights. In doing research for this video, I was reminded of fights like Henderson vs. Hua 1 and Hunt vs. Bigfoot 1, fights that will go down in history as all-time greats. And of course we have Vitor's absolutely demonic run in 2013. I can't say it was a good idea to let fighters use TRT, but I also can't say that I don't look back on this era of MMA with fondness and nostalgia. As always, I want to thank you for watching the video, as well as liking, commenting, and subscribing. I wanted to get this video out a bit sooner, but some things came up lately that slowed the process down. I think it still turned out pretty well, and it was a nice little compilation of the history of TRT. The situation is obviously a lot more complicated, but I tried my best to keep things simple and easy to follow. Because, as I said, some aspects of the story are extremely convoluted, and probably could have 10 to 20 minute long videos made about them if you really wanted to comb through all of the details. Either way, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you would like to support the channel, please check out the links in the description. I'd also like to thank my supporters on Patreon who help make these videos possible. Thank you, BoneCK, James Taylor, Dan Thomas, Derpatronus, Mike Roballs, Traumahound, CP, The Son of Man, Neem, Origami Fleshlight, Kevin Howard, Medication Doesn't Work, and Jackie.